carry on with, we're still in Norway, but we're with a plant which is probably, or a genus which is probably the most used vegetable, wild vegetable around the world, and it's nettle, or Nestle. I think probably most people here have eaten nettle soup in the springtime or something similar. It's very popular, the most popular Norwegian vegetable. You can think actually when you're eating your nettle soup in the springtime, you should be aware that you're part of a global movement of nettle eaters, because practically everywhere in the world has its own local nettle species. So wherever you are, in Asia, in North America, even in some African, in the Central Africa, there's a species called Artichokes Masai. Okay. And in all cultures, people have used nettles for food. I'm not going to talk for a long time about you know, the good properties of nettles, etc. You can read about this in the book and in other places. But I'll just show you a few pictures of different types of nettle. This is me trying to impress people. Actually it's a stingless stinging nettle, because there are varieties or subspecies of our own stinging nettle, the brand Nestle, which lack the stinging hairs. So if you don't, and everybody should have nettles in their garden, I think. Everybody. I mean, it's really one of the best vegetables in the springtime, and it's also a fantastic plant for insects, and particularly particularly butterfly larvae. A very useful plant. And if you don't like that, you don't like the stings, then you can maybe plant one of these stingless varieties, which are becoming available now. This is from a market in Italy, in Venice, in springtime. In many parts of the world, they sell nettles as a vegetable on the markets. This is Urtica cannabina from Siberia, in the botanical gardens in Oslo. And this one to the left here, death nettle. Urtica ferox, ferocious nettle, which comes from New Zealand. Actually can be eaten, but you really take a big risk. No, it's not that serious, but people have been known to die when they're out in the bush a long way from help and they fall into a... these can be 2-3 meters tall. And you can see they've got serious stingers on them. I didn't dare. Luckily it hasn't survived in my garden, it's not very hardy, but it was fun to grow it one year. And there are many recipes and ways to use nettles. This is an Italian recipe that actually could have come from Norway, because we have most of the raw ingredients here. It's actually a potato pasta, okay, with sauce made of nettles. Nestle gnocchi, nettle gnocchi. Of course, we have to include dandelions. And dandelions are really probably one of the most important plants in the world these days. And the reason for that, there are many reasons. Apart from the fact you can actually make a whole dinner with dandelion. You can use the roots as a root vegetable, you can use the young shoots, the young leaves as a vegetable. There are 5 or 6 different vegetables from dandelions. Use the flowers in salads. You can use the flower buds to make capers. You can make coffee from the roots. You can make wine from the flowers. So yeah, you've got everything from the one plant, and we curse it. Why do we curse it? It's a fantastic plant, and it also looks beautiful, don't you think? Actually, if you think of it in a different way, it's actually a beautiful plant, and it's highly successful. And in fact, there are thousands of dandelion species in the world. There's the pink-leaved, pink-flowered dandelion from Siberia, which I've found growing as an ornamental in gardens in the far north of Norway. There's white-flowered, various white-flowered species, including the one from Svalbard dandelion, which is white, grows just outside of Longyearbyen, totally edible. And there's this lovely red-leaved dandelion, Taraxacum rubifolium, which has leaves which are really nice in mixed salads in the springtime for a bit of colour, and probably extra healthy too. But one of the main reasons that I say it's one of the most important plants in the world today is because last autumn they finally made a car tyre with dandelion rubber. From the rubber dandelion, which looks very similar to, it has yellow flowers, it's very difficult to separate from the common dandelion we see. It's a species that comes from West Asia. All dandelions can be used to produce rubber, but this one has extra good quality. And actually 15 years ago I was the sole supplier of seed of this particular species of dandelion. It turned out that around about 15 years ago, various researchers around the world working on rubber were given the job to look at alternatives to the natural rubber trees from the tropics, because there is a fungal disease which is seriously impacting some of the populations. And because they're all clones, there's no genetic variability. One tree gets it, they all get it. So they were looking for alternatives to the rubber trees to produce rubber, and preferably, for example, in the US. Okay, rubber is extremely important, you know, is equally important as oil almost. The plant, it turns out, is the best alternative to the rubber trees is dandelion. During the last World War, there was actually quite a lot of dandelion rubber production, both in Russia and the US. At that time, it was also difficult to get rubber from the tropics. So Taraxacum is on its way. So soon you can cycle home from your dandelion party as well. And here's me in Japan, seeing for the first time the white-flowered Taraxacum albilum. See the joy on that guy's face. Often sold on markets. This is from southern France, blanched either in the field by putting soil over the young plants or in darkened houses to make for a slightly less bitter experience. This is in my garden. This is actually a French cultivar, a French variety of dandelion, which looks very similar to our weed dandelion that we have, but it has more upright leaves and very dense, so quite high production. So this has been blanched in my garden using just having a pot over it in the very early spring. And they look beautiful when they're blanched. Another thing, yeah, we have a Facebook group, of course, Friends of Taraxacum, so please join us. Lots of interesting stuff going on there. I learnt on an American foraging forum just a few years ago that actually the dandelion flower stalks were actually very tasty. I always thought they would be very bitter to taste. But if you take them just before the flowers start appearing, the buds when they're still in bud, and you just cook them very quickly and add some butter, you get what I call Lervenudler, or dandy noodles. And it was surprisingly not bitter. So please try it. But people are very different in their sensitivity to bitter. So you have tasters and non-tasters. And the other real gourmet product from the dandelion is the Lerverskok, or the dandychoke, like artichoke, but in a similar way to the artichoke, it's under the flower. Okay? When the flowers start appearing in the early spring, you see them appearing right at ground level. And if at that time you dig down to the root, there's about this distance of leaf which is not exposed to the sunlight. So this white bit you see here is delicious. and blanch naturally by the growth method of the plant. And dandelion tempura from Japan. And then we have Løpstikke, or lovage in English. Very popular, very hardy plant that many people have in their gardens. We tend to use it in Norway as a soup ingredient. But you don't need much of it, do you? It's very, very strong tasting. But if again you blanch it in the springtime, it becomes much milder, and it becomes like a slightly strong celery. So I call it spring celery. And it's perennial, very hardy as I say, and it comes back year after year after year. So and as you can see, in the springtime there's absolutely no damage from insects or anything. If I try and grow celery in my garden, it's always heavily attacked by snails and slugs in the autumn. So much easier to grow organically. Yeah.
Will you bleach the vegetables?
Yeah.
What does that do to the nutritional value?
Yeah, I think I've seen a few analyses of that. It doesn't make a huge difference, I don't think. But do you know, Eva? Have you seen any analysis of that? There aren't many analyses on it, but I don't think it's. I mean, it's not something. It looks as though I'm blanching everything here, but I don't. You know, it's a mixture. Yeah. But just because it's something which isn't often thought of.
Yeah.
It's more it changes the taste. Yeah. But I don't really worry about nutrition and that kind of thing personally, because I have a wide range of different vegetables, and I think I probably get all my, well, I feel anyway, I get my needs. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of milder, you can eat more of it, but
yeah.
you might not have to eat more.
Yeah, yeah, perhaps. Exactly. If that's your main focus, then maybe you shouldn't blanch, but yeah. And I also use perennials to make seed sprouts in the springtime. So these here are planted in earth in the autumn in a bucket. They've left outside because they will only germinate if they've gone through this cold period. Stratification is it called, technically. I bring it into the house in the early spring. They start germinating, and I just use them as a spring vegetable in salads and things. So you can do that. There are many different possibilities. I think I'm kind of running out of time here, aren't we? What's the time now? 23. Okay, we'll take this last one from Norway because that's particularly of interest to you. Carver, or caraway, is probably the most used wild plant in Norway. It's used mainly in the past, mainly used as a herb, as a spice. Well known for being used in aquavit, of course, and in various cheeses and surikål, sauerkraut. But you can also use, is a tradition in Norway, an old tradition, to make what's called karvakål soup. Has anybody here eaten caraway soup? Yeah, a few of you. And you take the young shoots of the caraway plant in the springtime, and this is using caraway to make a soup. You find this tradition throughout its wild geographical range, which is from Norway to the Himalayas. So it's a wild plant over that whole area. So you find that people make soup from the young, or use the young leaves in different ways in the springtime throughout this range. Apart from that, it's also a root vegetable, which not many people are aware of. And this was discovered actually in the mid-19th century by Professor Schubler, who works as a botanist at the Botanical Gardens in Oslo. And he's well known for setting up research stations to trial new, novel vegetables and ornamentals in different parts of Norway. So we had research stations in Finnmark, in southern Norway, all over the place. And he also travelled quite extensively, also in Europe. And on one journey to Austria, he discovered that above the tree line in Austria, they were actually using caraway as a root vegetable, like we would grow carrots or parsnip, pastinak, gulrot. They had selected caraway for large fruits, and the roots themselves, if you've had caraway soup, you'll know are quite sweet tasting, quite pleasant tasting actually. And when he came back to Oslo from that trip, he was inspired by this, and he asked his research stations all over the country to send him seed. And he started to try and select, so he grew them and tried to select for larger and larger roots. And he wrote after some years that he'd managed to produce a caraway root with as large roots as, what's it called, Hamburg parsley, a root. You know this? So quite a good size. So it's just a picture. I'm doing the same thing. The Norwegian Genetic Resource Centre have also collected caraway from all over the country to look for better varieties for aquavit production. So I got seed from all these different ones and playing around trying to select for larger roots, because I think this is a root vegetable that we need. I can't be self-sufficient in carrots, in my garden, because the seed doesn't mature. So I have to bring in new seed every year. I like to save my own seed. But caraway is totally hardy, it grows all over the country and very easy to take seed off. So I think we need it. Distribution of caraway throughout Norway, very large distribution. Okay, we're past that. A little bit about a project I'm working on. We're looking for tips from the public for old Norwegian perennial vegetables. So these are, and herbs. Herbs are Norwegian vegetables that are over 50 years old. So if you've got a grandmother or something who's been growing a particular herb or vegetable for that long time, we're interested to hear from you. Okay? There's a list there of the different ones in Norwegian that could be of interest. Asparagus, different types of onion, løpstilke, stolpenrik, etc. So contact me if you have any information. Okay, Western Central Europe. One of my favourites and my oldest perennial vegetable is strandekål, or sea kale, Cranberry maritima, which is related to kale, but a completely different family. It grows along the coastlines of Europe, including Norway, up to as far north as Trøndelag. There's one location in Trøndelag, but mostly along Sørlandet and kind of the south of Norway to the Swedish border. Also widespread right the way down into the Mediterranean, in the Black Sea. It grows on coast there too. So this is a plant which tolerates quite high salt conditions. So another possibility to grow commercially on salt land, and that's certainly been doing now in they're growing sea kale commercially in the Netherlands on salty land. And in the 19th century, this really, and I think of sea kale as kind of like the king of vegetables. It's the royalty of the vegetable kingdom. Partly because it was used by royalty and favourite of the royalty, but also in the UK in the 19th century, it was traditionally it was harvested from the beaches by people, and they discovered that because it grows on very exposed beaches, sandy beaches and rocky beaches, which are exposed to wave activity in the winter. So during the winter, often these plants will be covered with seaweed or with sand or whatever, and the young shoots that grow up through that sand or seaweed were naturally blanched. They were white, and they were much tastier because the green sea kale is quite strong tasting. And this is probably where blanching of vegetables originated. People observed in nature that the young shoots were much tastier, and therefore they started themselves deliberately going down to the beaches and putting seaweed or sand over the plants, and then coming back a month later and harvesting the product. But eventually it became so popular also in the cities, it was picked in such large amounts that it was began to disappear. And in the 1890s, it was actually protected in the UK. So it was forbidden to take from nature. So I would encourage you to grow it in your gardens rather than collecting it from the beaches in southern Norway. It's relatively easy to grow. As I say, my oldest plant is actually 30 years old, or more than that, 35 actually. And it still produces every springtime, so it could be. And it's also a beautiful plant when it's in flower. You can use the flowers. This is a traditional forcing pot for planting in a garden, but it's only the rich people that could afford these, of course. The poor people would use labour and put earth, heap earth over the plants. In fact, the poor people reckon that the product under these things was not good. It was not as good as doing it by hand, because it was very hot under these in the sun. So so it changed the taste apparently.
Can you grow it inland, away from the coastline?
Yeah, well, I grow it in my garden in Trondheim.
Yeah, but you're close to the fjord.
Yeah, I'm quite close to this, so I have a relatively mild, but areas which have good snow cover, it's worth trying. In my garden, it's I have lost plants in the past that haven't been, so I actually cover with leaves or something to give it an extra protection in the winter.
So that's more important than the salt.
Hmm?
You
Oh yeah.
don't need salt.
Oh, it doesn't need salt. No, definitely not. No, it doesn't need that. But I use seaweed, as you can see here. This is seaweed mulch around the plants, which I collect from right below my house. So I've only used seaweed as fertilizer in my garden for 30 years. So I've not used animal manure or anything like that. It seems to work. Good stuff.
Yeah, I'm growing it. And how much? So it could definitely grow in.
Good. Excellent. And the broccolis are also delicious and actually much milder tasting, so they don't need any blanching or anything. But then you don't get the flowers. This is from Lindesnes, from a tour I did. Beautiful plants. Some years ago, now we're on southern England. These are the chalk cliffs in Dorset, the so-called Jurassic coastline. This place here to the top left is Durdle Door, it's called. This is a place that where I spent my holidays with my family in a tent when I was a young lad. In connection with my mum's 80th birthday some years ago, the whole family gathered at this place again. And to my big surprise, the cliff tops were a pure vegetable garden. There was this is wild beetroot, strandbete, which is the ancestor of all the beetroot vegetables. So you have beetroot, you have Swiss chard, mangold, you have sugar beet, of course, which is hugely important. They all stem originally from this wild plant, and they're still using the genes within the wild plant, for example, to breed resistance against the fungal attack in these vegetables. And it's actually a perennial. So the wild plant that all these vegetables stem from is perennial. So there's now interest within permaculture and people interested in perennial vegetables in growing them as leafy vegetables, as perennials, which is interesting. Right beside it was this plant here, which is a wild kale, ground called, in seed. This is the seed head here. And these are perennial kales as well, as I mentioned earlier. And this is wild carrot growing beside them. So it's amazing. As I say, kales and the huge variety of different conventional cabbages and kales and broccolis that we have today, they're all derived originally from perennial plants. And that perenniality has kind of disappeared. So if we grow the conventional vegetables, most of them today, they die after flowering in the second year. But luckily, thanks to home gardeners, in just a few home gardeners in Europe and North America, Some of these old perennial kales, which were much more common 100 years ago, have survived because they're very valuable vegetables. So, for example, we have Ornamentals kale, which is from France, which is a low-growing kale, and these can all be very old, and they're mostly propagated by cuttings rather than from seed. So you just break off a side shoot and give it to your neighbour. So it's very easy to do. So we don't need any international seed corporations to sell us seed. We can actually just pass over our cabbages to neighbour. There's also an ornamental variant of Ornamentals, and it's, as I say, it's low growing, and it's sometimes the stalks, they fall over and they root in the ground, and in that way they can spread to make quite a big clump over many years. Behind it is a tree collard, called, which various, I think, quite a few members of our Norwegian seed savers are now growing, thanks to Andrew McMillian, who's here somewhere, I think. They're still in the meeting, I think, yeah. And this one is actually from North America. And I've seen pictures of them in California, up to 3 meters tall. And they can be very old, and we think that possibly they originate with the slave trade from Africa. Because the only place in the world which still grows commercial perennial kales is Kenya. Sukuma wiki is the name. From Belgium, a few gardens in one small part of Belgium have preserved this old Erdiger called Erdiger moss in Belgium. And one garden in the UK has grown Taunton Dean's cottager's kale right up to the modern day. Yeah, thanks to the increased interest and realisation that the plant genetic resources in these vegetables are very important for, at least for breeding purposes, and we think also for in the situation where we find ourselves with climate change, etc., that particularly perennials, that these have survived is quite remarkable, actually. That they're now safe and now grown by quite a few people within Europe and Norway. But they're not 100% hardy. You can't grow them everywhere in Norway. But you can take cuttings in the autumn and overwinter indoors and then plant again in the spring if you're in such a climate. That's what I do in Trøndelag. I visited this English Taunton Dean's cottager's kale. This was the picture I took about 5 years ago. I came back to this place last summer, and this is what it looked like. Huge, big stem, and you know, you see this guy here, see how big it is. The pigeons, Dune, they were eating the tops of it, so otherwise it could have grown even bigger. So they're quite impressive plants. Yeah, this is an old Norwegian ornamental plant which you find can be a bit invasive in gardens. So you see it particularly in old gardens, which is also a vegetable which has an interesting story from the UK, because in the UK they have a tradition, a very old tradition, to make something they call Easter ledge pudding or dock pudding. Dock is like høymolle, you know, rumex family, sorrel, things like that. And it's actually a vegetable patty, grønnsakscarbonade, carbonada, made from whole barley, and the whole barley was cooked together with a whole range of different vegetables, wild and cultivated. So we have rhubarb, for example. Some people use rhubarb in this vegetable. This is lady's mantle, marikulpe. Here we have, but it had to have ormerot or bistort in as an ingredient. It's nettles. This is sorrel, and this is blanched dandelion. And in 1973, in this very small village in Yorkshire, in northern England, Mytholmroyd, they decided that they would, they saw that this traditional dish was in the process of disappearing. So they decided, a few people decided that they would announce the World Dock Pudding Championships. They were the only people that could do it in this village, you know. At least they thought so, because I'm trained. I'm going to take part. But each house had its own recipe and used different herbs and, you know, so they even announced this competition in the Times of London since 1973. And thanks to that competition, it's now a dish that has been preserved, and that competition is still being arranged every year. Yeah, we'll go past Ramslök. We all know about that. Ramsons, time is going. North American ramps, which is a very similar species, which is also in the process of being eliminated from nature because of over-harvesting, unfortunately. And then we come to horseradish, which I've mentioned earlier, pepperrot. I always harvest roots. You know, I use the roots. You always have too much horseradish. It grows and spreads. So I dig up the roots and I store them indoors in my cold cellar. And then as we approach the springtime, I plant them up and they start sprouting. In the dark, they produce these blanched, very tasty spring shoots, which are no doubt highly nutritious. And a bit later on, the flowers appear, and they're also fantastic to look at and also to have in mixed salads. They're quite strong tasting, but when you mix things, that also is a form of dilution, so you don't experience the bitterness so much, etc. So nobody ever made a dandelion salad on its own. It was always made mixed with other things, or mixed with oils and vinegars and things to disguise the bitterness. So don't bother trying to just to eat it raw if you think it's too bitter. Try it in a mixed salad, because it dilutes the taste. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah.
When you take in a root for the winter, do you take, how much soil do you kind of bring with you?
I usually store it in damp leaves. We've got plenty of leaves in the
you
garden.
don't take that much of the soil?
No.
itself?
No, I dig up the root as it is and
Shake it off and
shake it off and just, you know, or you could just plant it in a big pot and put the pot in the cellar and then just bring the pot into a cold room in the late spring, and or even in the middle of winter, and it will start sprouting. And you could do that with a whole range of different perennial vegetables to extend the season. Yeah, just to mention, I don't think we've really got time. We're running out here. What's the time now? 44, 20 minutes now. Haven't really got time. Also, puree, leek, was also derived from a perennial plant. And the wild species it's derived from, there are still varieties of wild leek which are grown on a small scale locally, all the way from the UK to Afghanistan. So, but our present day puree or leek, sometimes it does, if you grow it on the second season, it flowers. Sometimes you'll see it start multiplying. There'll be side shoots forming, and that's a kind of a throwback to the original perenniality of that plant. I'll go past that. Okay, we've come to the Mediterranean countries, and that's an area that was hugely inspirational for me. We've all heard of the Mediterranean diet. Some years ago they discovered that old folks living in the mountain villages in the Mediterranean countries, they had very low levels of heart and lung disease, etc. And plant scientists or ethnobotanists, they got the job to try and find out what the hell these people have been eating all these years. And actually, just in the course of the last 20 years, they've discovered over 3,000 different plant species used by the Mediterranean peoples traditionally. Huge diversity. And not only that, they also discovered that there are many examples of multi-species dishes. So dishes made with, for example, over 50 different wild and cultivated herbs in the springtime. Everything from salads to pizzas to soups. And this was kind of like a spring ritual. You know, spring had come and they needed a boost of vitamins and stuff, so they went out and they made these special dishes. And that's and the mixed salad is an example of that. And this gave the inspiration then for these multi-species salads that I started making. Just a few examples through the years. And my own diet, Barstow's diet, 80 a day keeps the doctor away. And we've also, because we can do it, we made a pesto with 230 different types of onion, and we made a ferment with, it's the world record ferment with 412 different plants. You can ferment anything. Really tasty, and fun to make. That was with Rita Amundsen, if you know her, in Oslo, who's the Norwegian fermentation queen, I think. Yeah. And I also made this calzone. You all know what calzone is nowadays. You see it sold particularly in Oslo, everywhere. Kind of in-box pizza. And this was a recipe I found in Sicilia with over 50 different species. And this here took me 6 years to make, because first I had to grow these these 50 species so they all were available at the same time. And it took a couple of hours to put together, and yeah, crazy, yeah. Mediterranean, another family which is extremely important, wild collected, is Scorzonera. We know Svartrod Scorzonera is an old vegetable here in Norway, which has had a bit of a renaissance in recent years. Has anybody seen it in supermarkets here? No, I've seen it in Sweden. You have? Yeah.
No, but I tried to grow it, but it just wouldn't grow.
Wouldn't grow? Okay. Well, the seed didn't germinate, or?
Little small seeds, but then I just,
Okay, okay. Try again. It's relatively easy. This plant here, it's mainly used for the root, you know. And my oldest Scorzonera is actually 35 years old, and I got it as a plant originally. So these could be older than you. But nowadays they're mainly grown as annuals for the very long, thin roots. But Scorzonera is much more than that. It's actually a spring lettuce substitute, so you can use the young leaves as the base of a salad. They're very mild tasting, like lettuces. And later on in the season you can use the flower stems, which are actually very sweet tasting, surprisingly sweet. You can use the flower buds in, for example, stir-fry dishes, and then you can use the flowers in salads. And you can continue doing this for your whole life if you want to, because those plants just come back again and again. The roots, after a couple of years, get a bit too coarse, so forget about them. Just grow them as a vegetable. Different species of Scorzonera and Tragopogon, which is Yaitsheg, and what's it called? Havrerot is another one. They're biennial. Yeah, we've talked about artichokes, so we'll hop over that. Hop over these. Hops is a fantastic spring vegetable that very few Norwegians eat, but very popular in Italy. Here on the market in Venezia, Venice in the springtime, huge bundles of hop shoots used as a vegetable. And don't worry, you guys, you can still make your beer, because take all the shoots and they'll come back and still produce your hops.
You stir fry?
Stir fried, yeah, a salad, whatever, yeah. It's in the book. And there's another tradition from Belgium, which produces a huge amount of hops for the beer industry. Traditionally, the workers were the hop vines were often what do you call it? They were cut, you know, and pruned, besharked, and the workers got to take the top shoots home as a vegetable. And they also have a tradition called Jet de Hvordan, where they produce blanched hop shoots, which is a delicacy in Belgium. You can see them here. The very thin shoots here are hops, and these are asparagus, the very thick ones. Yeah, could talk a long time about Spansk chervil or sweet Sicily, but we won't today. I think most of you know that one. In the Mediterranean countries, the recipes are generally quite simple. They go out and they pick the vegetables. They're cooked very quickly in water, and the cooking process often has to do with some of the herbs that they mix in are toxic when they're raw, but detoxicated when they're cooked. Plants like clematis vitalba, Tusk clematis, German old man's beard in English, is one of the most commonly wild foraged vegetables in Italy, despite the fact it's actually slightly poisonous raw. But it's cooked, and the cooking detoxifies. So they basically cook them up, and then they stir fry them in olive oil, add a little bit of garlic and often chili these days, and then they just mix it with scrambled egg arrow. And if you want a gourmet version of that, so you just add a few flowers. Yeah, we'll get past that. Asparagus we've talked about. Got to get finished. Chicory. Huge variety of vegetable chicories. I grow a lot of them nowadays more, rather than kales, because they're much, or cabbage family, because they're much easier to grow. There are very few insects and other things that attack the chicory family. And chicories are also derived from wild perennial plants. And they're rather beautiful in flower as well. Just a few pictures of different chicories. There are chicories for making coffee alternative, and chicories as root vegetables. Ones for sprouting in the cellar in the winter. Eulasalat, I think you call it, or chicons. Perennial. Yeah. We'll go past these ones, running a bit out of time. We'll get to the Caucasus. Say a few words about this area. One of my favourite perennial vegetables is this one here. Hablitzia tamnoides, or Stjarnemelde Caucasian spinach, and I have some seed of this one as well, which I usually have with me in my talks. This is a plant which, as I say, originates in the Caucasus. It came to Scandinavia in the 1870s and was originally grown as an ornamental plant. It's a climber, which can climb to 3 to 4 meters during the summer, and was used originally as an ornamental. It was popular from about 1870 to 1920, after which there were new, better climbers, I guess, that came in and replaced it. But in the meantime, some people had started eating the young shoots. It's related, it's in the same family as fat hen, or what do you call it, melderstock, which is an annual weed, which is delicious as well. So kind of related to the spinaches and that tribe. So some people have learned that this was actually quite tasty, and some of the old plants in old gardens from the 1920s have actually survived right up to the modern day. So these could be really old plants. I had a project for the Nordic Gene Bank a few years ago, where we collected seeds from it was about 5 or 6 different places in Finland, 2 or 3 in Sweden, and 1 place in Norway at Hodsel Prestegård has had some vicarage in Vesterålen, up near the Lofoten Islands, where one plant has survived right up to modern day. And they're now, the seeds of those are now preserved in the Nordic gene bank, and probably some of them are up in Svalbard at the preservation. Because this vegetable really is probably the most Scandinavian of all vegetables, because actually it was unknown as a vegetable outside of Scandinavia until about 10 years ago, when I wrote about it in Permaculture magazine. So it was totally missing from all these, like KUNNSKAP 2 doesn't mention it, Plants for a Future doesn't mention it. So it was a closely kept secret in Scandinavia. And it's an incredible plant. It's my oldest plant, which is 15 years old. It produces about 250 shoots in the very early spring. So unlike hosta, for example, which starts appearing in May, this one actually has young shoots already, which actually appear in the autumn and stand over the whole winter, totally unaffected by temperatures down to -30 in Finland. And then during March they start extending, and you can start harvesting towards the end of March, even in a place like TRøndelag. They're mild tasting. They can be used raw, and they can be used as a spinach plant. And today, probably, there are now thousands of people growing this around the world. Not a huge number, but thousands, thanks to the social media. This is one of the few vegetables, is actually, or the first vegetable that really has gone a bit ballistic through being spread over Facebook and Twitter and etc.
But you eat the leaves too, right?
You eat the very young shoots,
And the leaves.
but you can use the leaves later in the season. They're actually, you can use them cooked to make a spinach pie or something. It's a spinach pie from the older leaves. That's what it looks like. It climbs up into trees in nature, so it's a very good, doesn't need any sunlight either. Although it does grow a bit better if you give it some sun. But certainly. We have our own Facebook group, Friends of Hablitzia, where the centre of distribution of Hablitzia has happened, I guess. Also from the Caucasus, we have this relation of sea kale, buskstrømkål, or heartleaf cranberry, it's called in English, which you see occasionally in old gardens in Norway. A very, very hardy plant, much hardier than the sea kale that we grow that comes from the beaches. And it's also more productive than sea kale. Again, a bit too strong to eat without blanching, so it's best to blanch it. Again, all these are very large buckets over it, and there you go. And this actual plant here produces this much food on about this much soil in my garden. It's quite incredible. Yeah.
Does the lack of light affect the growth?
No, because the energy's in the roots. I mean, obviously, it's only once you've harvested, it will start growing again, and then it's in the sunlight, and it will continue growing. But I wouldn't take all the leaves. Yeah, just leave some to grow on, and they're tone green eventually. And yeah, you can also use the broccolis. Are very tasty too. Final leg, Himalaya, another fascinating allium, which I call Sherpa onion, or Nepal onion, which grows in very high in the Himalayas, and is a favourite of the Sherpa people that we know most from climbing Everest, etc. They had a home life, and this is one of the wild plants that they domesticated in their gardens and grow up there. And they're actually, they also grow and collect from nature in a large scale, and they're both dried and transported down to the markets in the lower lands of Nepal. A beautiful onion, very special onion in that it actually has it actually spreads by rhizomes under the surface. So it has roots, and it can appear suddenly 30 centimetres or so from the mother plant. And those rhizomes are also edible. There are a number of, it is sometimes grown in Norway as an ornamental. There are a number of different ornamental forms which are beautiful. Flowers in the autumn, and it's also special in the fact that I always think every spring that it's dead, because it doesn't start shooting until the end of May, very, very late. And I think this is probably that it's still remembering the monsoon rains in the Himalayas, which start in June. So it's kind of triggered to grow at that particular time of year, when the moisture appears, I guess. Anyway, and then last autumn, you harvest them at that stage. And last autumn, it turned out that there was a botanist from Nepal working in Trondheim. He contacted me, he heard about my garden and asked me to come and visit. And he brought his wife along, and here they are in my garden, and they were wandering around, and there were so many plants that they were finding that they knew from their homeland, including this Nepal. So they're meeting this Nepalan onion for the first time. They've never seen it live before, because they live in the lowlands. They've eaten it, they eat it a lot, but only from the markets, because it grows very high up, and Kathmandu, near where they live, is quite low down. So that was quite fascinating. They were so happy to find they had to come all the way to Trøndelag to find what they called Jimu for the first time. Anyway, and they were so inspired, all these plants, and they knew that they invited themselves to my house to make a Napoleon feast, which we did in the autumn, which is fantastic. So I could go out into my garden one day and I can forage from North America. The next day I can forage from the Himalayas, and I can forage anywhere in the world. I never know when I go out into my garden what I'm going to pick. It's always a surprise. Siberia, we're almost finished now. 2 more onions from Siberia. Lutans and senescens are cultivated, beautiful onions as well in Siberia, Siberian home gardens. And there's one curiosity which is called Norland's onion, which is now being distributed through, again, the Norwegian Seed Saver organisation. This was an onion which was found in gardens in northern Sweden, in Norrland, being grown as an ornamental. And it never produces seed. It turns out to be a hybrid between 2 botanical species. We don't know how it arrived there. It's not known from anywhere else in the world. Probably it just was 2 plants that crossed in some collector's garden, and spontaneously we have a very interesting, robust vegetable. Very tasty and very productive. And, is there one more? I talked a little about lilies. All liliums are edible. So, tiger lilia, martagon lilia, which are common garden plants in Norway, grown as ornamentals, have edible bulbs. I was in Singapore a few years ago, and they were selling lily bulbs, fresh lily bulbs in the supermarket. So I bought them, took them home, and I thought, I'll plant a few out in the garden and see what happens. 2 years later, this is what happened. So this was from a supermarket in Singapore. Not grown in Singapore, probably grown in the mountains further north. Very, very hardy plants. I've had those for several years. And the bulbs could be used, they use them just like we would use onions or potatoes, or as a carbohydrate source in the winter. And they're very tasty. This particular one has very sweet tasting. Some liliums have quite bitter tasting bulbs, so don't bother with them. Last few pictures just showing some more Ornamentals or Prudsaker from the Far East. So your garden can look quite nice and also provide you with food. And I think just about finally, this is Hvordan from my trip to Japan, which is a very important traditional vegetable there also. Invorrede grönsaker in my garden. A few words about, there it talked a bit about Norwegian seed savers. Come along, we have steering, no, not that you don't have to talk, just come and show yourselves, you guys. This is the steering committee of the Norwegian seed savers. Look at them. So please join us. We have a website here, NorwegianSeedSavers.no. Just click in here if you want to join us on this exciting journey of the world of edible plants and traditional Norwegian vegetables.
And if you want to be on the board, then please also send me.
You need some more. Yeah.
So we're looking
Stuart,
for
yeah.
board members.
No, interessert i å være med i styret. Så bare si fra. Fantastisk. So, I think that's just about it. One more. Takk for meg.